On a Sunday morning in July 1861, carriages rolled out of Washington by the dozen. Senators sat in them, congressmen sat in them, diplomats, journalists, and Washington society women in summer dresses sat in them. Some of these people had packed picnic baskets. Some had opera glasses. A few had champagne. They were heading southwest toward the Virginia countryside because everyone in the capital understood that a battle was coming that morning, and most of them had decided they wanted to watch it. Pause on that for a second, because it tells you everything you need to know about where this day was heading. The country had been officially at war since April, just 3 months earlier. Fort Sumter had fallen, Lincoln had called for volunteers, and 2 armies had been assembling on opposite sides of the Potomac River. And after 3 months of drilling, organizing, and political maneuvering, the accumulated wisdom of the moment was that a significant number of educated, reasonably intelligent people drove out of the capital on a Sunday to watch a military engagement the way you might attend a county fair. That is the world in which both armies arrived at July 21st, 1861, and the battle that followed makes considerably more sense when you sit with that image long enough. But before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe to support the community. He was a career officer with solid administrative credentials, reasonable tactical knowledge, and a clear-eyed understanding of exactly what his army was in July 1861, which was the source of his consistent, detailed, and ultimately ignored warnings to the Lincoln administration throughout June. At a war council in late June, McDowell told Lincoln and the cabinet that his army was not ready to advance. He said it plainly, and he said it in specifics. His officers, he explained, did not yet know their troops. His troops had received some drill but had never maneuvered as large formations over actual distances. His supply system existed more on paper than in practice. His medical infrastructure was barely organized at all. If there were casualties in the field, the capacity to treat them was shockingly thin for the scale of engagement expected. And the men themselves, patriotic and willing as they were, had no way of knowing how they would hold under fire because they had never been under fire. Lincoln's response was, by his own account, sympathetic and immovable. The Confederate Army across the Potomac, he pointed out, was also composed of volunteers with minimal training. If McDowell waited for a perfectly prepared force, he would wait forever. The 90-day enlistments that most of his soldiers had signed in the patriotic rush after Fort Sumter were running out. If the Army didn't move before those men went home, there would be no Army left to move. McDowell understood the logic and disagreed with its conclusion, not because the logic was wrong in its individual premises, but because it treated unpreparedness as being primarily a problem of the rank and file. What Lincoln's argument didn't fully account for was the nature of what an army actually is beneath the surface of the men holding rifles. An army in the field is a bureaucratic structure before it is anything else. It is a functioning system of food, water, ammunition, communication, and chain of command authority that has to hold together under conditions of extreme pressure. Building that system takes months of institutional experience that cannot be shortcut by enthusiasm, no matter how genuine that enthusiasm is. In July 1861, McDowell's army didn't have a functioning version of that system, and the march to Centreville was about to prove it in exhaustive detail. 35,000 men needed to cover roughly 25 miles in 2 days. It took 4. Soldiers stopped at blackberry bushes growing along the roadside, and the columns behind them simply stacked up and waited. Regiments took wrong turns, supply wagons broke down and blocked intersections for hours. March discipline, the art of keeping a column moving at a consistent pace, managing rest halts, keeping units in correct sequence, requires officers who have practiced it in real conditions. Almost none of McDowell's officers had. When columns halted to rest, resuming the march required coordination that nobody had established procedures to execute. So what were supposed to be 20-minute halts stretched into 2-hour layovers in the Virginia heat. Some soldiers, finding their packs too heavy after the first few miles, threw rations into the roadside ditch to lighten the load. They arrived in Centreville already hungry, already worn, and already days behind the schedule the entire operation depended on. A regimental officer wrote in his diary that moving his men down a Virginia road felt less like commanding soldiers and more like steering a county fair toward the horizon. He meant it as dark humor. He also meant it as a faithful description. McDowell had hoped to arrive at his attack positions with some element of tactical surprise still intact. That hope had been dead for days before the march even started. Confederate sympathizers in Washington, and they were numerous, operating through the social and political networks of the capital with near impunity, had been passing information southward almost as fast as Union decisions were being made. A woman named Rose O'Neill Greenhow ran an intelligence operation out of her Georgetown home that would eventually lead to her arrest, but not before she had forwarded detailed warnings about the Union advance to Confederate Commander P.G.T. Beauregard. Beauregard knew McDowell was coming before McDowell's columns were fully assembled. Here is what makes Bull Run genuinely revealing rather than simply a story about Union failure. Confederate knowledge of Union intentions did not translate into Confederate military readiness, not even close. Beauregard commanded a Confederate force at Manassas Junction that was, in the most concrete and measurable terms, nearly as unprepared as the Army marching toward it. The Confederate States of America had been a country for 5 months. Its military was being assembled from components that didn't fit together. State militias with incompatible equipment and wildly different training levels, officers who had resigned U.S. commissions and brought professional knowledge but no experience commanding at this scale, and volunteers from across the South who had arrived with enormous enthusiasm and minimal military skill. Confederate logistics at Manassas were strained to the edge of dysfunction. Weapons were not standardized across units. Some Confederate regiments carried modern rifled muskets. Others carried obsolete smoothbores. A number of men had simply brought their own hunting rifles from home. The ammunition for these different weapons was not interchangeable, and distributing the right rounds to the right unit under battlefield conditions required a supply organization that the Confederacy had not yet built. Food supply was barely adequate. A Confederate surgeon inspecting the Army's medical preparations described them as almost non-existent for the scale of fighting that was expected. The uniform situation on both sides created a problem that patriotism could not solve and that would cost lives before noon. Confederate units were generally expected to wear gray, but several Southern state militias had long traditions of wearing blue. It was the standard color for many state forces, North and South alike, going back decades before the war. Some Confederate regiments at Manassas arrived in blue uniforms. Union units were supposed to wear blue, but some northern state militias wore gray. Two armies that couldn't reliably be distinguished from each other by sight were about to fight on the same piece of Virginia hillside in smoke and noise, at ranges where visual identification could be reduced to a few seconds. This was not an abstraction. It would become one of the day's decisive moments. General Joseph Johnston held a separate Confederate force in the Shenandoah Valley, and the Union plan required a general named Robert Patterson to keep him there. Patterson was 70 years old, cautious to the edge of paralysis, and commanding his own collection of undertrained units. Johnston slipped away from the valley on July 18th with minimal difficulty. He loaded his brigades into railroad cars in what military historians have identified as one of the first uses of rail transport to strategically shift an army during active operations in American history, and moved them east toward Manassas. The logistics of this movement were complicated by a shortage of cars, which meant brigades arrived in a staggered sequence over 2 days, each needing to be sorted and positioned with limited knowledge of the terrain they were defending. Johnston, who outranked Beauregard, technically assumed command of the combined force upon arrival. Both men spent the night before the battle refining plans that would bear almost no resemblance to what actually happened. McDowell's plan for July 21st was not unreasonable on paper. He would pin the Confederate center and right with smaller demonstrations while sending his main force on a wide flanking march around the Confederate left, crossing Bull Run upstream at Sudley Ford and rolling the Confederate line from a direction it hadn't fortified. The plan required timing. It required multiple columns moving in coordination. It required speed. The flanking column set out before dawn and was immediately behind schedule. Regiments moved in the wrong sequence. The lead elements didn't clear the start point fast enough for the units behind them to maintain proper spacing. By the time the column reached Sudley Ford, it was approximately 3 hours later than planned. Whatever element of tactical surprise the approach might have carried had been consumed by the march itself. Nevertheless, the Union attack made real progress in the early hours. Through the late morning, Union forces drove Confederate defenders off Matthews Hill and pushed them south toward Henry House Hill. There was genuine, intense fighting through this period. These men, however green, however uncertain, were not lacking in physical courage. Regiments from New York, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan advanced under sustained fire and broke Confederate positions that couldn't be reinforced quickly enough. The Confederate left was in genuine danger of folding. Then several things happened in close succession that changed the direction of the battle entirely. A Confederate signal officer named Edward Porter Alexander, a young man who would later become one of the war's most capable artillerists, was positioned on high ground with a clear view of the surrounding countryside. He spotted the glint of sunlight off Union bayonets and rifle barrels moving through the trees to the north, the tail end of McDowell's flanking column still arriving. He worked his signal flags. The warning reached Confederate commanders on Henry House Hill in time to begin shifting forces toward the threatened flank. The Confederate signal system had been established only weeks earlier and had never been used in battle. It worked precisely when it needed to. Johnston and Beauregard, who had been trying to manage an offensive on the Confederate right that was already falling apart, threw their energy into stabilizing the left. They fed in brigades piecemeal as Johnston's units continued arriving from the valley by rail. Disorganized by the movement, unfamiliar with the terrain, but continuously arriving in a way that kept the Confederate line from collapsing entirely. 2 Union artillery batteries, under Captains James Ricketts and Charles Griffin, pushed forward to the crest of Henry House Hill with the intention of dominating the Confederate position. Griffin, scanning south, saw an infantry line approaching. He moved to open fire on it. A nearby officer overruled him. He believed the approaching soldiers were Union infantry coming up as support. They were the 33rd Virginia, wearing blue. By the time the error became clear and Griffin swung his guns around to engage, the Virginians were close enough that their volley swept the battery crews from their pieces. Horses went down, gunners were killed or wounded at the wheels, and the batteries were effectively destroyed in place. The Union guns were captured and held for the rest of the day. Thomas Jackson's Virginia Brigade had positioned itself behind the military crest of Henry House Hill, invisible until an attacker crested the ridge, sheltered from artillery fire, able to absorb pressure that would have broken less methodically placed formations. Barnard B., rallying collapsing South Carolina troops nearby, pointed toward Jackson's unmoved line and said something that has been argued over ever since, but the name Stonewall attached itself to Jackson that afternoon and never let go. What is beyond dispute is what Jackson's brigade did. It held the center of a Confederate position that was in real danger of unraveling, and it held it long enough for the afternoon to turn. The Union attacks on Henry House Hill were repeated through the early afternoon, and each time they stalled in the same places. McDowell's soldiers had been on their feet since before dawn, had marched through summer heat, had been fighting for hours, and were running on the far end of their reserves. McDowell had no substantial force in hand to commit. He ordered the attacks repeated. They failed again. He ordered them again. They failed again. When Jubal Early's Confederate brigade swept in from a position to the west and struck the exposed Union right flank, the result was less a tactical reversal than a psychological one. The right flank began to give way. The withdrawal of the right made units in the center feel dangerously exposed. The center began to pull back. The pullback of the center communicated to units on the left that something had gone wrong that they couldn't see, and they began to withdraw too. Each movement rearward made the next one feel not just permissible, but urgent, and by late afternoon, what had begun as a retreat became something considerably less organized. The road running north toward Centreville was the same road those carriages had driven south on that morning. The picnickers and the congressmen and the society women were still out there when the army came streaming back. Supply wagons jammed the road. Equipment was dropping into the ditches. A Confederate artillery round struck a wagon on the bridge over Cub Run, overturned it, and blocked the crossing entirely. Men went around the wagon, through the stream, up the muddy banks, still moving north without stopping. Rifles were dropped, blankets were dropped, packs, representing days of preparation, were abandoned in the road by men who did not look back. Officers shouted at men to stop, and the men walked past them. McDowell tried to establish a rear guard at Centreville. It held briefly, then dissolved, because there was no mechanism to compel a force that had not yet learned to be an army to hold ground once the structural will to hold collapsed. The road to Washington was littered for miles with everything 35,000 men had been carrying that morning. The Confederate Army did not pursue with any meaningful force. This is the detail historians have found most difficult to explain, and the honest explanation was given eventually by Johnston himself. His army was nearly